excited to announce our next keynote speaker, Professor Sandra Wachter, who's a professor of technology and regulation at the Oxford Internet Institute, University of Oxford, where she researches the legal and ethical implications of AI, big data, robotics, the internet, and platform regulation. Her current research focuses on profiling, inferential analytics, explainable AI, algorithmic bias, diversity and fairness, as well as governmental surveillance, predictive policing, human rights online, and health tech and medical law. So a wide diversity of very important areas. At the OII, Professor Sandra Wachter leads and coordinates the Governance of Emerging Technologies research program that investigates legal, ethical, and technical aspects of all these different areas. And I can list about 10 different institutions where she holds very influential positions and has contributed very profoundly to the field. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for the introduction. Yes, thanks so much for inviting me to give a talk today and to talk about some of my current research projects. Before I start, just 2 sentences about the amazing team that I'm working with. So I'm a lawyer by background, and I think about how we can govern emerging technologies, but I don't have to do this by myself. I have an amazing team of people who do this with me. So this is the amazing people that I'm working with. It's a mix of people from different backgrounds, ethicists, lawyers, computer scientists, psychologists, and people from political theory. And we think together how we should govern emerging technologies in a responsible way. So if you're interested in some of the work that we have been doing, this is the web page and the OII, why our work, if you want to figure out what we have been doing the last couple of years and where the road ahead will lead us. But yeah, let's talk about generative AI and some of the reasons why I got interested in working on this topic, in more detail. I think it started a little bit when I saw that a lot of different sectors, very high-risk sector or influential sector, started to heavily invest into generative AI. So for example, we can see that a lot of banks starting to use generative AI. So this is just JP Morgan, but Deutsche Bank, Goldman Sachs, Morgan Stanley, Moody's, they're all heavily investing into generative AI, wanting to speculate on the market, give financial advice to institutions for wealth management. So you can see there's heavily investment going on in that area. Also, the legal profession, which is my own profession, is heavily investing into generative AI, promising people that they can use AI for legal tasks, which is a quite interesting thing that we see. And so the question is this problematic in any way? Or should we be excited about this? And I think it helps if we think a little bit about how generative AI works, what it can do and what it cannot do. So let's just ask the question. How does generative AI, or large language models in more detail, how does it actually work? So there's this wonderful example by David Smerdon, who has done better than anybody else. So I want to cite him here because it's a really, really great example that really exemplifies what JetGPT or any large language model does. So he talks about an interaction that he had with JetGPT, and he asks the chatbot, what is the most cited economic paper of all time? He gets an answer back very clearly. It says, the most cited paper of all time is a theory of economic history. Douglas North and Robert Thomas wrote that in this year in this journal, and it talks about the fact that, how many citations it has and the content of it. So ask a concrete answer to a concrete question. So just out of curiosity, who in this room would have also known that this is the answer? No one. Don't feel bad, that paper doesn't exist. It's completely hallucinated. So hallucination means that that thing makes something up that has no reality in fact or truth. But it looks really convincing, right? And so the question is, how could this happen? How could JetGPT come up with that type of hallucination? Well, we have to remember how large language models work. What they do is they try to predict the next word in a string of words based on what it has seen before. So what is it that JetGPT might have seen before? Well, it might came across this interesting article that talks about the fact that in the last 70 years or so, the most cited papers in economics all had the word economic and theory in the title. Out of those highly most cited papers, all of them had the word history in the title. So there is your explanation as to why a fear of economic history was this hallucination title. But we need an author. Who do we take? Well, we take Douglas North, who is a person that used to be a work in economics, a Nobel Prize laureate, has over 100,000 citations, and is a person that did definitely work in that area. So what ChatGPT also found out is that in economics, the most highly cited papers always have two authors. So we need a second author. Who are we going to take? We take Robert Thomas, also a person that did exist, also a person that actually worked in that area and published with Robert Thomas on a similar topic. So here's your explanation how that fake title came actually up. And so what that means is if you have no idea what you're talking about, right, and you want to just bullshit your way through it, that's a really good way of kind of getting it right. But if you're after truth and fact and detail, this is actually a big, big problem. And it's a big problem because it's not outrageously wrong. Like both authors that actually exist, they worked in the same area, they published together. So it's not immediately detectable that this is a hallucination. So this is really, really important to keep in mind, right? It is not a librarian. It's not a person that understands your query, that goes back to an archive that has been curated by people. It is nothing else but a statistical program that is trying to predict the next word in a string of words based on what it has seen before. So what has it seen before? Well, the training data is pretty much the whole internet, including sites like Wikipedia and Reddit, both who are now beacons of wisdom or fact, and, of course, books, right? Science fiction books, for example, a system that doesn't understand the difference between fact and fiction. Now, this is not the only reason why it's so easy to fall prey to those hallucinations. In fact, they are designed to fool us in a certain way. And this has to do with the fact how those systems are being fine-tuned. So what happens when those systems are being trained, people have the job to look at the output and rank it, right? And wherever they rank it, it goes back to the feedback loop and then improves the system. This is called reinforcement learning with human feedback. So there's somebody that looks at the output and says good or bad, but they're not ranking it according to the truthfulness. They're ranking it according to how human sounding it sounds. Is it convincing? Does it keep people engaged? Is it going to lead to customer adoption? Is it going to lead to profitability? Does it keep people on the platform? That's the thing that you're after. Truthfulness is not high on the agenda in that feedback loop, right? So that is a problem. It's supposed to sound helpful. It's supposed to sound human. Truthfulness is not important. And another reason why it's really problematic that we might, when we interact with that, has to do with our souls itself, because we anthropomorphise, right? We see ourselves into everything. So as soon as we see language, we assume intent. We assume there is somebody that has a motive, that understands what we're saying, that we're communicating with an agent similar to us. And we conflate speaking with intelligence. And that is a big, big issue when we interact with those systems, because we might actually fall prey into what they're saying. So it's much better to think of those systems as the middle key of your cell phone. So if you press your middle key a couple of times, the autocomplete function, that is a large language model on steroids. Right. Why am I telling you this? Well, because those really, really important sectors are starting to invest and offer products on the market here. So LexisNexis, for example, they are offering a tool that is hallucination-free, interesting, to help the legal profession. Or here, also Thomson Reuters, who own Westlaw, say that they're now introducing those AI-generated tools. And they say, don't worry about it. We only put good law in it, and therefore it will not hallucinate. Interesting, right? But yeah, that's an interesting marketing choice here. So I got interested in this. Okay, well, if we know that those systems hallucinate very, very often, and those systems are being used in areas where truth and detail matter, do those systems actually have a legal duty to tell the truth? And so when we started with that journey, we started to test around how prevalent those hallucinations actually are. And we came to the conclusion that they're very, very prevalent. There is a lot of research out there that shows that that thing is wrong roughly 60 to 80% of the time. That's a lot. You're better off flipping a coin, right? But I'm going to give you one of the examples of the hallucinations that we found that can show you how dangerous those systems are. So this is an interaction that we had with Bing a couple of months back, where we asked Bing, why was Boris Johnson indicted? It answers back, Boris Johnson was indicted on 37 counts of various crimes related to his conduct as Prime Minister in the UK. Interesting. I did not know about this. And usually I follow the news. I did not hear this. But very convincingly written, right? Very self-confident. And it gives you footnotes, sources. So one footnote, one source is the Financial Times, the other one the BBC. Those are good sources. Those are good sources I would usually trust. But if you click on the Financial Times, you see what actually happened. This is the actual headline. Trump was charged with 37 counts. Boris Johnson just stood down from Parliament. It's kind of funny that you would confuse those two, but it's nonetheless wrong. Right? It came up with wrong information and was spreading misinformation in that sense. And so we have to be very careful about this. And then I was like, okay, well, if it hallucinates all the time, and we know that it's being implemented in so many high-risk areas, how does industry respond to that? Do they own up to that problem? What are the things that they put in place to prevent this from happening? And so we looked at how they express the functionality of their products in public. And so this happened roughly, I think, 2 years ago or so, when ChatGPT opened its door to the world, and very roughly after there was panic. Right? And a lot of people said, we need to pause now. It's really important that we think about the implications because AI is so smart, so powerful, so intelligent, so much better than humans. We need to think what that means for us. And a couple of months later, an even more panicky statement came out and said, AI is so smart, so much better and more powerful than humans, it causes maybe extinction at some point, the same way that pandemics or war would. Very, very, very loud, shouty. And so that's interesting because, you know, it's, on the one hand, to the public, they say, this is really smart, this is really powerful. And then I ask myself the question, because I'm a lawyer, how do they talk about their products in the fine print, in the terms and conditions? Very different tune. Much more humble tones all of a sudden. So they talk about, yes, of course, you know, it may give you incorrect information about people, facts, and places, right? It is just an experiment. Always use your judgment when you use those systems. Of course it makes mistakes. If it's important, then you should double check it for sure, right? Of course it can be deceitful. Of course it can lead to misinformation. And here, ChatGPT, very, very down there, says, of course, always check it. ChatGPT can make certain mistakes. Or Microsoft here says, in the drop-down menu, somewhere hidden, that of course, it's not always accurate. So there's a mismatch and screaming from the rooftops how smart and powerful your system is. On the one hand says, but it's your problem if it fails. And remember, because I'm a lawyer, I thought, okay, well, maybe the law did something, right? Because the law might help us here. In reality, companies are not owing up to the side of the bargain, not taking responsibility for this misinformation type of spreading. Maybe the law does something here. And as many of you know, we now have the Artificial Intelligence Act that was just passed. It's going to be applicable in the member states and probably also beyond the borders of Europe. And so I looked at this in more detail and tried to figure out if there are any safeguards in there that would guard against this problem of hallucinations. And this is an interesting paper, of course, I can't go into detail, but long story short, no, it doesn't. The law actually is not going to help us here either. There are certain types of regulations in place that govern those systems, but nothing that helps us with truthfulness, right? The majority of things that you will have to do is be transparent about the capabilities of your system, but you don't have to live up to a certain standard of capability. So it's not the same. Like, you know, transparency about a harm is not the same as responsibility for a harm. The only thing that we have is a watermarking requirement, which is not a bad thing. So that means if you're interacting with an artificial agent, or if you're seeing artificially created content, you're supposed to know that you're consuming that. Nothing bad with that. I think it's a very good idea, and it would help with some of the stuff. But it doesn't tell you anything of the truthfulness. Artificially created content can be accurate, right? But nothing in there that will require companies to be more involved in making sure that hallucinations don't happen. So in reality, what we have is more or less a transparency requirement for outputs, but no requirements for developers to design those systems that reduces the chance of hallucinations. There is a little bit hope still that we're going to have some type of regulation that will help here, because the AI Act is not the only framework that is going to come into force. The AI Act is also accompanied by the so-called harmonized standards. That always happens in European safety product law. That means you have a law, and how to implement it is being done with standards, standard process. So there could be, down the line, a requirement that says you have to make sure that your systems are truthful to the best of your knowledge. But it's questionable if that will happen, because who writes those standards? So the majority of people who are sitting in the working groups are sent from industry. So the majority of people writing their own standards are the people that developing those products and want to bring it on the market. And how do we know that they follow those standards? Well, somebody has to do a conformity assessment. So somebody needs to certify whether the product that is about to go on the market adheres to those standards. Who does that? Industry as well. So they're self-certifying whether the product that they want to bring to market lives up to the standards that they have written for themselves. I'm being cynical here, right? This could work, but it could also go terribly wrong. And it is definitely something that the legislator was aware of and said, this is actually not an ideal solution. We should have an independent third party certifying those systems before they go to market. But unfortunately, this is only a recital that is not legally binding, and the legally binding text doesn't have anything in there that says at what point we're going to move to a more accountable system. That is, in my opinion, a big problem. And it's also a problem because the legislator didn't take the opportunity to create more individual recourse mechanisms for people that are being harmed. So we have a new product liability directive that is going to come into force very soon. But unfortunately, how that harm is defined probably will not give many people recourse. So what do I mean by that? If you're being harmed by an algorithmic system, you can go to court, but only if you suffer a material harm. So that means destruction of property, death, personal injury. Immaterial harm, so immaterial harm that you cannot see, is not something you can get compensation for unless it is a side effect of a material harm. But there are certain material harms you will never get compensation for, which means, for example, discrimination. So if a system is biased towards you, no compensation for you. If it infringes your privacy, also immaterial harm, no compensation for you whatsoever. With the Boris Johnson example, his reputation is being tarnished. That is a privacy harm. He wouldn't get any recourse for that. And nothing for economic losses. So if you're an investment banker, or a journalist, or a doctor, or a lawyer that uses that to make decisions, and you're hurting your client and you're losing money, no compensation for you either. So it's a big problem in terms of liability. So after I say that companies are not owning up to the side of the bargain, I don't think the legal side is really fair at the moment. I got interested in the question of what it is that we can do to still use those systems in a safe way that reduces the chances of hallucinations. So this is something I worked with two of my colleagues at the OII, where we try to figure out how to use those systems in a way that reduces the chance of that happening. And I think the most important thing is that we really start thinking about a new mental model, or how we think about the capabilities and the limitations of those systems. There are just certain things that we should never use generative AI for. In short, if you don't know what the answer is, don't ask ChatGPT. Just don't do it. It is not a magic 8-ball. It is not the Oracle of Delphi. It has no idea of the truth. So for example, this is something that even a lawyer had to feel not too long ago, that used ChatGPT for research and tried to find sources about cases, handed them in to court, and all of that case law was hallucinated, right? And he got into big, big trouble, obviously. Wouldn't get any compensation, by the way. But that's a big problem, right? And so we really need to think about ways that are safe to use them. So what are ways to, in a safe way to think about them? It's not a magic 8-ball that tells you the truth. It's much more like a little bit like an unreliable research assistant. That's probably the best way to think about it. They can be super helpful, but they can also get things really wrong. And that's the best way of thinking about it. So if you have somebody that you're working with that you know is unreliable, what is it that you do? Well, you have to give them input data that you know to be accurate, right? You shouldn't ask open-ended questions. You should give concrete commands of what it is that you want. Give concrete guidance of what it is that you want. You should have a good idea of what the end result actually should look like, and you should always double-check it. And so we did this in a couple of experiments here. Because in reality, the thing that I worry about is not those outrageously wrong hallucinations. I worry about the ones that are really, really subtle, the ones that we cannot really spot. I'm not worried about asking ChatGPT what the capital of Germany is, and it tells me Rome, because most people will know that. I care about the ones that probably not even experts can spot anymore, and that then filter in an ecosystem where truth and fact matter. So this is something that we did in testing as well, where we asked ChatGPT to write a two-paragraph summary of the General Data Protection Regulation. And it does it, and it says, under GDPR, you can process personal data, but it requires explicit consent. So that's wrong, but not outrageously wrong. It's just wrong enough. Because in reality, you have much more legal bases that you can use if you wanted to process personal data. Explicit consent is only one of them. But how many people would have known that? Unless you're a data protection lawyer, unless you're an expert in this, probably not. And it's still, again, very, very convincingly written. And so what we say in that paper is that, again, don't use it for truth seeking. If you want to use it as a zero-shot translator. So that means that you're trying to construct the prompts in a way, or structuring prompts in a way that forces the model to predominantly rely on the input data that you gave it and you know to be true. Because the thing with that system is it will never say, I don't know. It will never do that. It will always give you an answer. And it will give you an answer by going back to the training data. If you ask an open-ended question, it goes back to the training data and says, what does this look similar to? And if it can't find anything there, it will make something up. It will never say, I don't know. And that's a big issue. However, if you give it input data that you know to be true, and you tell it, translate it to something else, it can do it because it will rely on the input data that you have given it. And so we did the same experiment again, and this time it worked, right? So what we did is we had the same conversation again. We told ChatGPT to convert the following bullet points into a two-paragraph summary of the GDPR. We went to the ICO homepage, that's the regulator in the UK data protection, so they know what legal bases are actually allowed. We took this information, we know this to be true, and we say use this and write a summary, and it does it, and it's not a problem, right? And so yeah, I wanna close by saying I'm also excited about AI, but I really think we have to think about what it can and cannot do, right? Just implementing AI into everything is not gonna be useful. You always have to think about the question, what is broken, what needs fixing, and is that thing gonna fix it? It's never gonna fix the truth. It will never do that. It's not designed to do it, it will never be truthful. Hallucinations will never go away. But if you use it in a very specific way, it can be helpful. So yes, you can use it, you just have to be more careful and don't believe everything it says. Thank you very much.